A London night in the mid-19th century didn't just arrive, it descended upon the city like a heavy, damp blanket. A thick, yellowish fog, which locals grimly and ironically called, quote, zero, crept into every crevice, muffling sounds and distorting the outlines of gas lamps. In this haze, permeated with the smell of coal smoke and rotting refuse, a solitary figure moved along the brick wall of one of the warehouses in the dock area. The clatter of hobnailed boots on the wet cobblestones sounded muffled, as if the city was afraid to betray the man's presence. He wore a long, worn frock coat, cinched by a wide leather belt from which strange tools gleamed dully: pliers, hooks, and small metal cages. But the most remarkable feature of his appearance was not the tools, but his eyes, tenacious, constantly shifting, accustomed to discerning movement in absolute darkness. Beside him, like a shadow, trotted a small but muscular dog with a scar across its muzzle. They stopped at an inconspicuous door leading into the basement of a granary. The man took a vial of oily liquid from his pocket, uncorked it, and the air filled with the sharp aroma of anise and rhodium. This was not just a smell, it was a challenge to the million-strong army hiding on the other side of the wall. The man took a deep breath, nodded to the dog, and stepped into the darkness, towards the thousands of invisible eyes watching his every move. In an era when the capital of the empire was expanding faster than anyone could control, it was precisely such people, balancing on the edge between the world of humans and the world of chaos, who were the only barrier separating civilization from complete absorption by a living, wriggling, gray mass. To grasp the full weight of this man's mission, one must delve into the atmosphere of the place that spawned this threat. London of that time was a city of contrasts, with a dazzling luxury of the West End coexisted with the unimaginable poverty of the East. Slums, known as rookeries or crows' nests, were a labyrinth of dilapidated buildings where the concept of personal space was utterly absent. In areas like St. Giles or Seven Dials, entire families huddled in one room, sleeping on piles of rags or straw, snuggling together to keep warm. Windows were often boarded up to avoid paying glass tax, leaving the interiors in perpetual twilight. The air in these quarters was so thick with the exhalations of human bodies, food cooked over open fires, and lack of ventilation that it seemed one could cut it with a knife. But the most terrifying thing was what happened underfoot and in the courtyards. Sewerage, in the modern sense, did not exist. Instead, cesspits were used, deep tanks beneath houses where all waste was discharged for years. When the pits overflowed, their contents began to seep into the basements where people lived and spill out onto the streets. Along the narrow passageways between houses flowed open sewers, into which everything was discarded, from kitchen scraps to the contents of chamber pots and the carcasses of dead animals. In rainy weather, this hellish mixture rose, flooding the ground floors. It was here, in this realm of decay and cramped conditions, that an enemy older than any human dynasty found its ideal home. The brown rat, or Norway rat, which arrived in Europe on merchant ships in the previous century, brought about a true biological revolution. It was larger, more aggressive, and hardier than its predecessor, the black rat. The Norway rat swam excellently, could gnaw through wood and even soft metals like lead, from which pipes were made, and possessed phenomenal fertility. In the conditions of London's slums, where mountains of refuse provided an endless source of food, and the labyrinths of cellars and drains, ideal shelter, the rodent population grew exponentially. They stopped fearing humans. Chronicles of those years describe cases where packs of rats attacked infants in cradles, gnawed at the noses and fingers of sleeping adults, and completely destroyed food supplies in shops overnight. It was an invasion, a silent siege, against which the authorities had no weapon. In this critical situation, the figure of the professional rat catcher emerged. This was not just a job, it was a craft requiring a unique set of skills bordering on art and science. Unlike ordinary citizens who tried to poison rodents with arsenic, which often led to the poisoning of pets and children, but rarely harmed intelligent rats, the professional understood the psychology of his opponent. He knew that a rat was a social creature with a clear hierarchy and communication system. If one individual died in a trap, the others immediately learned of the danger and avoided that spot. The catcher had to outwit the collective intelligence of the pack. Great masters of their trade, such as the legendary Jack Black, elevated their profession to the rank of high art. Black, who called himself Her Majesty's Rat and Mole Catcher, walked the streets of London in a specially tailored scarlet uniform, breeches, and a top hat, attracting the attention of the crowd no less than a circus performer. On his wide leather belt were metal figures of rats, serving as a kind of quality mark. But behind the bright facade and theatricality lay the hardest, most exhausting work, coupled with constant danger. The catcher's workday often began when the city fell asleep. The main battlefield was not only the basements of houses, but also old brick collectors, storm drains, and the banks of the Thames. Descending into the dungeons of London at that time was a journey into the underworld. Old tunnels, built by the Romans or in the Middle Ages, were narrow, slippery, and full of poisonous gases. An accumulation of methane could lead to an explosion from a single spark of a lantern, and pockets of carbon dioxide could put a person to sleep forever in a matter of minutes. In addition, there was the danger of a sudden tide. The water in the Thames rose quickly, and many careless daredevils found themselves trapped in stone bags, where a sad end awaited them. In these conditions, the catcher could rely only on his senses and on his loyal assistants, ferrets and dogs. The hunting technology was perfected down to the smallest detail. Ferrets, flexible and fierce predators, were used to penetrate deep burrows and drive rodents to the surface. A small muzzle and a bell were often put on the ferret so that the catcher could hear its movement under the floor, and so that the predator would not kill the prey in the burrow, but specifically drive it out. As soon as the rats, mad with fear of their natural enemy, jumped out, dogs or the catcher himself entered the fray. Rat catchers had an incredible reaction, able to grab a running rodent with a bare hand so that it would not have time to bite. This required nerves of steel, because a bite from a brown rat in the 19th century was almost a death sentence. Infections carried with saliva caused severe fevers, blood poisoning, and often led to limb amputation or the end of life. The bodies of old catchers were covered with scars, a map of their professional battles. They cauterized wounds with red-hot iron or poured gunpowder directly on the spot to stop the infection, and continued working. However, the external conflict, the struggle of man with nature, was only the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface of this profession lay a deep internal conflict associated with the duality of their position. On the one hand, rat catchers were outcasts. Decent society wrinkled its nose at their appearance. They were not allowed into clean living rooms. They smelled of sewage and the menagerie. On the other hand, they felt their indispensability and even superiority. They entered the bedrooms of dukes and princesses when they screamed in horror at the sight of a mouse running by. They saw the seamy side of aristocratic life, their secrets, and their helplessness in the face of nature. This gave rise to a special kind of pride mixed with cynicism in the souls of the catchers. The same Jack Black could talk for hours about the habits of rats with the same respect with which a general speaks of a worthy opponent. He claimed that rats were smarter than many people he had met. This strange love-hate for their enemy became the basis of their identity. They lived off rats, they thought like rats, and to some extent, they themselves became part of this underground world, incomprehensible to the average person. But the most complex, ideological layer of the conflict lay in the paradoxical economics of their craft. The officially declared goal was the extermination of pests for sanitation and the peace of mind of citizens. But reality dictated different rules. The payment for killing one rat was minuscule. To feed a family and maintain dogs, which were very expensive, a catcher could not be content with simple extermination. And here, a shadow business emerged, turning the sanitarians into patrons of the epidemic. A live rat was worth many times more than a dead one. The main clients were the organizers of underground rat fights, a bloody sport extremely popular in Victorian England. In the back rooms of pubs, away from the eyes of the police, special arenas were set up, wooden pits with sheer walls covered with sawdust. A motley crowd gathered around, from dock workers to bored gentlemen seeking thrills. The essence of the spectacle was simple and cruel. A sack of rats was poured into the pit, 20, 50, sometimes 100 of them. Then, a specially trained terrier was released into it. Bets were placed. Could the dog neutralize a certain number of rodents within a given time? A timekeeper with a watch monitored every moment. A judge recorded the results. This was a business with huge turnovers, and rat catchers were the sole suppliers of material for these games. This created a monstrous conflict of interest. It was unprofitable for the catcher to completely clear an object of rodents. If he destroyed all the rats in a warehouse, he would lose a source of income for the future. Moreover, he needed to catch them carefully without damaging them so that their marketable appearance was preserved until the moment of sale to the fight organizer. Thus, a hidden ecosystem was formed. The catcher, called to fight the plague, became a farmer cultivating it. In their homes, they kept hundreds, sometimes thousands of rats in cages, awaiting lucrative orders. They fed them, cared for them, so that they would be active and aggressive in the arena. Some went even further and engaged in selective breeding. Jack Black himself noticed that among the gray common rats, individuals with unusual coloration sometimes appeared, pied, spotted, or albino. He began to select and crossbreed them, developing fancy rats. He sold these cute creatures to noble ladies who kept them in gilded cages in their boudoirs. A surreal picture emerged. The very same creatures that spread typhus in the East End slums sat on silk pillows in Belgravia mansions, simply because they had white fur. Ratcatchers were a bridge between these worlds, manipulating the fears of some and the whims of others, profiting from the very existence of the threat. A key tool in the hands of the ratcatchers and the main protagonist of the rat pits was the dog. It was precisely the need for effective rodent extermination that led to the emergence of a whole range of terrier breeds that we know today. Breeding was conducted rigorously and purposefully. A dog for a rat pit had to be not just strong, it had to possess lightning-fast reactions, tactical thinking, and absolute fearlessness. A rat cornered fights fiercely. It is capable of biting into the nose, eyes, or throat. In a pit, where dozens of opponents faced the dog simultaneously, any mistake could cost the dog its sight or its life. The famous terrier Billy, in 1823, set a record by destroying 100 rats in 5 minutes and 30 seconds. This achievement made him a legend, and his owner a rich man. Dogs were valued more than people. A good ratting terrier cost as much as a worker's annual wage. Ratcatchers cherished their dogs. The best veterinarians treated them. They were fed select meat even when the owners themselves were starving. The attitude towards the dog was the only manifestation of sincere, non-commercial affection in this harsh world. The dog was a partner, a protector, and the only creature the ratcatcher could fully trust. However, while ratcatchers reigned in the dungeons and pub arenas, the world around them was preparing for a grand transformation. The hot summer of 1858 became a turning point in London's history. The water level in the Thames dropped, exposing meters of foul-smelling silt consisting of filth accumulated for decades. The sun heated this mass, and the city was enveloped by the Great Stink. The smell was so monstrous that sessions in the newly built Parliament building had to be interrupted. Curtains soaked in chloride of lime did not help. Legislators, choking on the miasma, finally realized what doctors and engineers had been saying for years. The city was dying in its own waste. An emergency bill was passed giving engineer Joseph Bazalgette unlimited powers and funds to create a unified sewage system. What Bazalgette did was an engineering marvel, comparable to the construction of the pyramids. He designed a system that not only drained sewage, but intercepted it before it reached the Thames. About 2,000 kilometers of brick tunnels were laid under the streets of London. These were not old, permeable drains, but sealed collectors lined with particularly strong Portland cement. The tunnel walls had an egg-shaped cross-section, which allowed the water flow to self-clean, washing away sediment even with low pressure. Grand pumping stations, such as Crossness and Abbey Mills, resembling Byzantine temples in their grandeur, lifted tons of sewage and sent it far downstream into the open sea. This construction redrew London's underground map. Old boroughs were filled with concrete, ancient riverbeds of underground rivers were encased in pipes. Access to familiar migration routes for rats was blocked. This was the first blow to the empire of ratcatchers. The new sewers were impregnable fortresses. Smooth brick walls offered no purchase for claws. Powerful water currents washed away all living things. And the absence of open cesspits deprived rodents of a food source. Rats did not disappear, but their habitat became controlled. Simultaneously with the engineering revolution, a chemical and scientific revolution was taking place. The development of chemistry gifted humanity new, highly effective poisons. Strychnine, phosphorus pastes, and later anticoagulants made the process of pest eradication impersonal and mass-produced. Now there was no need to hire an eccentric man with a dog and pay him for each tail. It was enough to scatter poisoned grain. The process of deratization transformed from a hunt into a routine property maintenance procedure. The culmination of the profession's decline was the change in the moral climate of society. In the second half of the 19th century, the movement for humane treatment of animals gained political weight. The Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, RSPCA, launched a crusade against blood sports. Bull baiting and bear baiting were already banned, and now public attention shifted to dog fights and rat pits. Despite the rat being considered a pest, the public spectacle of its killing for entertainment began to be perceived as barbarism, unworthy of a civilized person. Police raids on pubs increased, and fines grew. The legal market for live rats collapsed. The shadowy economy that fed the ratcatchers crumbled. Without income from betting, the profession lost its financial appeal. The old masters were leaving, Jack Black lived out his days, selling his signature oils and telling tales to onlookers, but his fame faded along with the gas lamps, which were being replaced by electric ones. The new generation did not want to get dirty and risk blood poisoning. Factories, docks, and railways offered more stable earnings. The image of the Ratcatcher transformed from a mysterious hero of the underworld into a dirty, suspicious type who had no place in the modern city. They were replaced by state sanitary inspectors, people in uniform, with notebooks and instructions, for whom a rat was not an opponent, but a statistical unit to be written off. Nevertheless, the resonance of this story is still heard today. The lesson the Ratcatchers taught us is multifaceted. Firstly, it's a story of incredible adaptability of both rats and humans. We saw how a person can find their niche even in the most disgusting conditions, turning the fight against grime into an art and a business. Secondly, it's a reminder that technology solves problems more effectively than individual heroism. Bazalgette's sewer system saved more lives than all the Ratcatchers combined over a century. The systemic approach triumphed over manual labor. But there's also a third, more unsettling lesson. The history of the sport with rats shows the dark side of human nature, our tendency to turn violence into entertainment. We condemn the Victorians for their cruelty, but are we not ourselves consumers of other, more refined forms of cruelty on the screens of our devices? Today's metropolis seems sterile. We rarely see rats during the day, but if we go down into the subway late at night or peek into the back alley of a restaurant, we'll understand that the war isn't over. It has simply transitioned into a Cold War. Rats have learned to avoid surveillance cameras. They've developed immunity to many poisons. They've studied the garbage collection schedule. We've made an unspoken pact with them. We don't see you as long as you stay in the shadows. Pest control services wage an endless battle using scientific methods, but the principle remains the same. It's a fight for resources and territory. Victorian Ratcatchers were more honest in this struggle. They looked the enemy in the eye. We, however, prefer to delegate this unpleasant duty to slow-acting poisons, so as not to think about how exactly the end comes for creatures living parallel to us. Concluding our story, we mentally return to that warehouse door where a man stood with a lantern. Now, it's most likely a fashionable loft or an office center of glass and concrete. The smell of, quote, one is gone. The air is cleaner, and the Thames, thanks to Bazalgette's legacy, is once again full of fish. But if you put your ear to the ground, through the roar of trains and the vibration of the city, you can discern a faint rustle. Life below continues, and the spirit of the old Ratcatcher, with his cages, terriers, and philosophical attitude towards death and life, has not disappeared without a trace. It has dissolved into the very fabric of the city, reminding us that civilization is a thin crust over chaos, and there must always be someone ready to descend when that crust cracks. History doesn't put a period, it merely turns the page, leaving notes in the margins for those willing to learn from the past, looking into the abyss beneath their feet.